Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final lecture of the Designing for Sound series. It's great to see some regular faces who have been here stoically, every single one, which I'm really thrilled and pleased to see you. So tonight, the last one, we have Tomás Méndez from Venezuela and now from Block in Switzerland. Tomás came to my attention probably a few years ago now due to a friend at work and pointed out a series of really important similarities in working methodologies that we are developing at Flanagan Lawrence and that Tomás was also doing in actually starting to look at genetic algorithms to develop acoustic spaces. This, I think, is obviously the new use of new technology, which no one really has done before. And it's very innovative, and it's highly exciting to have Tomás here to talk to us about it. Tomás has got a PhD, he got it from, what's it, the University of?
Zurich Polytechnic.
Got it there, alongside some other stalwarts who've lectured on the series, such as Arthur and Luca. So, with no further ado, I hand over to Tomás to tell us all about the search for algorithmic acoustic design. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here to give you this introduction into the work I've been doing. It is most of it is the work I did for my PhD or during, in some cases, my PhD. And at the end, you'll see a little bit of what I'm doing now at the Block Research Group. I'll try to keep the credits and the people involved straight for you to appreciate and contact them if you want. So I am an architect. I started in this ordeal, let's say, as an architect, and however technical and messy things get, just remember that it all started from a really architectural point of view and priority, let's say. And I'm going to try to explain what those are. I like to think that good buildings, or my favorite buildings, are those who can integrate into its geometry, into its concept, performance, structural performance, energy performance, and of course acoustic performance. And this is what I've been trying to do since. I think if you really design an object from the beginning, thinking of everything, or as much as you can, you have quite a better chance to create something of high quality. Such high quality I started seeing in this room. This is the aula magna of my, one of my universities, my first university, the Universidad Central de Venezuela. It is a fan-shaped room, so it has still some issues, but there's really quite a nice story in the collaboration in this project. You might recognize that the acoustic panels are actually Alexander Calder sculptures. So the architect started building this room and realized that he had an issue. So it's not, at the beginning it was not a very happy beginning. But then he contacted both Berenek and Newman got involved very deeply into this project, and they created this masterpiece of architecture where Calder design is not mobile but stabiles, and the acoustics of the room are particularly nice for I wouldn't say large orchestras, but because it is a mixed speech and music room. But what struck me the most is the way that the acoustic concept is deeply integrated into the concept of the room. And I have since searched out buildings with this kind of quality and strive for this kind of idea. You've probably seen this kind of curve a lot. They became quite popular when all sustainable things started happening. They basically say that in early design you have the most opportunity to increase the quality or the energy performance, and the more you go along on the project, the more costly it is to do changes, and the the lower the influence will be. And I started thinking, what does it mean in terms of computation and design tools? And mostly what we have seen so far is optimization tools, where this happens at the end. We use genetic algorithms or search algorithms in general to figure out how big the bolts should be or optimize a little bit of material here and there. But what I try to do is to actually use these things in the beginning where they can have the most impact and where they are most useful because they can find information, collect useful data in the beginning. And here I like to call this search, not optimization, because the purpose is entirely different. So just a little definition of what I mean is for search. Rational and systematic exploration is key words, I would say, of the field of possible solutions during the early stage of design, considering multiple disciplines and contrasting objectives. So again, if you design something to integrate a lot of performances, it will mean that those performances will interact and they won't necessarily be nice to each other. Some things will be good for structure and bad for energy, or vice versa. So this is the scenario. I'll be describing this little loop that I basically described. That's what the search algorithm that I'm using. So there's a search engine, in this case a genetic algorithm. There's a parametric model that I don't think I have to go too much into, but I'll show a little bit what I've done with them. Some sort of performance analysis. In this case, I will concentrate on the acoustics, but you can argue that these things are used in structural design, energy, cost, even construction constraints. So let's start a little bit with the parametric modeling. This part here. We are most familiar with parametric models changing some sort of parameter that defines the geometry or some value on some pipe that pumps in more air or less air, and then we optimize for it. But really, in parametric modeling, you can define quite a lot. We will see, for example, in the last object that parametric modeling, parametric search can really apply to large spaces, small spaces, parameters that are not geometry, but for example forces, or we will see many examples, and of course the shapes or the actual instances of models that you can get from a parametric model can be entirely different or not even recognizable. So just to show you what I can do or what I have been done, or people have done even more, I'm going to show you a little bit of a project that I collaborated with. I am not the acoustician in this project, nor am I the architect. I was a consultant. You can see me right at the end, the smallest credits over there. I did mostly parametric modeling and consulting. The acquisition was Nagata Acoustics. This project is ongoing. It's a social music school in Caracas. This is a big system that produces quite a lot of talent, and they are now building a lot of concert halls. The next one will probably, if it happens, it will be by Gary. The architects are ADJKM architects. And the theater planner, which I work a lot with, is Doc Seno, especially Franz Swarte. So it is quite a big building. There's 3 rooms, 2,000, 1,400, and 500 people. So quite a lot of classrooms and rehearsal rooms. So it's a really packed site, which is was the main issue. The client wanted a high number of seats for the sites because this is all about inclusion and having quite a lot of students. The main concept was to connect this boulevard with the park, so the big rooms are lifted from the ground into these gigantic pillars that you see. So these are the 2 big rooms. As you can see, there's quite a lot of seats and not a lot of space. Unfortunately, the acquisition was involved when the project was a little bit far along, so the structure was already very well designed because Caracas is a highly seismic city. So the structure was not movable anymore when the acquisition went in and saw that they needed more room. So basically my role there was to fit 2,000 people within the constraints of the acousticians. They wanted, these are all vineyard rooms, so there's quite a lot of walls in between for the early reflections. So I built this Python script to design the rake such that every little terrace in the room would have the best possible view. In this case, you can even, from this point, you can even see the orchestra pit, but this is not entirely possible for all positions. So I built this parametric model and then put it into Grasshopper so that the architects could play with it. So the parameters there were not actual geometry, but the dimensions of the seats and the height of the people, and the position of the viewing point, the minimal viewing point. So in this case, it was the conductor's feet. But if, for example, in the side terraces would be the last cellist. So they had quite a nice tool to play around and to visualize the maximum heights that they could achieve. Nagata almost always places a canopy 15 meters above the stage, so you don't want the public to see the top of the canopy, and that was kind of our ceiling, I would say. So it's quite a challenge to fit all these people in the height that we had. Just a few more images. It was also a variable stage. So this is pretty much a symphonic configuration for normal size symphony with a choir behind it. But then, because this is a social program, quite a lot happens that they have, I would say, even 400 musicians on stage, mostly children. But they wanted quite a big stage for this kind of occasions without a choir. Orchestra pit, no orchestra pit, so sometimes they even do dance. So you can see that the design kind of required for a really flexible model that could accommodate all of the changes and study as many options as possible. This is the 2,000 seat room, and this is the 1,400. This is more of a vineyard than the last one, and quite a lot of different raves. This is the 500 people room, which is quite an experimental room, I would say. Chamber orchestra mostly, but then, yeah, the idea is for it to be a little bit more of an experimental room. This building should start construction perhaps at the end of the year, hopefully. What I also started doing in this project and then a little bit on is a little bit more performance-oriented parametric models. So it's quite easy to put in a surface and start casting rays and see what the coverage of the area is. But this, of course, is just very preliminary shape design that doesn't really give you the performance. How does this shape actually translate into sound and sound quality? So of course there we come to performance analysis. I guess we were used to seeing FE models of structural design or energy calculations where we were mostly measuring physical phenomena with numerical models. When we talk about acoustics and room acoustics for music performances, this becomes a little bit more complicated because we're dealing with people and taste. And the main question is, can we actually measure how good the acoustics are of a room? How do people like this room? We can measure physical phenomena, we can measure impulse responses, but how does this translate into what's a good room and a bad room? Acousticians and psychoacousticians have been working on this problem for quite a while, and there's still a lot of controversy, I would say. The predominant, or let's say the state-of-the-art, the most established method is based on the impulse response. So is the idea of measuring the entire reflection response of the room, starting from the direct sound. Here you see Trevor Cox firing his gun. So basically, you fire an impulse, and you measure in a lot of listening positions, as many as you can in the room, but of course that means you need a lot of microphones. You can also use a more sophisticated sound source. And you measure the early sound, the late sound, how the sound decays in all of the listening positions, and of course this is different for every sound frequency. So we have frequency-dependent values. We now do this also in computational tools. Perhaps the most established one is the ray tracing tool that is now mostly combined with image stores, and then you get room acoustic packages that are commercially available, or for example, IEDELearn acoustical simulation, which is a Rhino plugin that I've been using in most of the work that I will show. The reason, one of the reasons that I use IEDELearn is that it's the only one that I actually, at least until now, lets me interact with it through code, so I can script and use its functionality directly and iteratively from, for example, a genetic algorithm, whilst, for example, commercial software packages generally don't allow this, so you would have to do this kind of by hand, which is not possible. So again, what do we do with this impulse response? We have room acoustic parameters. This is a review of a room acoustic parameter by Abdu and Gui. There's quite a lot of them, and they all describe the different, most of them describe different aspects of the impulse response. The mother of all room acoustic parameters, of course, is reverberation time, created by Sabin. As most of you know, it's the time it takes for the sound to decay 60 dB in the room. But this is, of course, just one parameter that we use. In my case, I use it mostly to dimension the material absorption in each room. In my work, I've been following Bradley's classification of these parameters. He mentions 4 main categories of these parameters. So you can see them as subjective impression, so reverberation, clarity, sound strength, and spatial effects. And for each one of those, we chose one of them, one parameter, that we thought could describe or best describe each one of these categories. Perhaps the last one is a little bit too wide to narrow down in just one parameter. But nevertheless, we chose LF early. So for reverberation, we chose early decay time, which is this, same idea as reverberation time, but it's the decay, the projection of the decay after, so it's the progression of the decay from 10 dB all the way down to 60 dB. So it's the curve that you see. The reason this is employed and not the reverberation time is because a lot of the sensation of reverberation that you see happens in between notes, not at the end of a final note. So what you perceive most is actually not a big interruption, but you see the reverberation in between notes. So you perceive mostly the first decay. So this is considered by some acousticians as the most representative reverberation parameter. Then for clarity, we chose C80, which or the early to late sound ratio. This is the relation between early reflections and late reflections, specifically dividing early and late in terms of milliseconds. From 80 milliseconds to 0 is early and 80 on is late. Sound strength is of course G, which is also called relative strength. So it's the comparison of the entire sound pressure from 0 to infinity at the point of measurement compared to the same sound source at 10 meters in open space. And for a spatial impression, we chose LF early, which is the ratio of the confined to the 80 milliseconds, the ratio of the total sound energy compared to the lateral sound energy. So you measure this with a figure 8 microphone that measures the sound coming from the sides, and then compare it to sound in all directions. So of course, these are all just physical measurements taken from the impulse response. But then what do we do with these measurements? How do we know if the room is good or bad? We ask people that listen to a concert in a room, what do they think about this room? Is it too muddy, the sound? Is it too clear? Is it reverberant? Is it enveloping? Is it intimate? Is it loud? There are many methods of doing this. I'm showing you Baron's questionnaire, and from those questionnaires and actual measurements from the room these people listened the concert in, acousticians have gathered optimal values for these parameters. So if we, for example, know that for a fact that most people like the Musikverein in Vienna, we go measure this room and see what is the early decay time in this room, what is the clarity, and then we derive such values. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of agreement on these optimal values. Even if you compare Baron to just Beranek, another prominent name, for example, the optimal value for clarity is quite different. Baron likes a room to be quite clear as long as there's not too much reverberation, whilst Beranek likes the room to be not so clear, so under 0 dB. So again, can we measure the quality in the room? Are we really ready to say that these are, in fact, the most important parameters to determine the quality of the room? Probably not, but it's the best that we have at the moment. But acousticians are still working on it, and I'll show a little bit of that. So this is, for example, an audio simulation of the Aula Magna room that I showed you in the beginning, showing the distribution of one of these parameters, in this case early decay time, in the room. So we have a lot of measurements in this room of each parameter. So then again, how can we gather one value for this room? Do we just average all of the values? I don't think that's a good idea. I'll be showing you what our proposal is. But before, I was talking about another way of looking at sound quality, and this mostly concentrating on early sound, so the first milliseconds. And this is, of course, not new. Perhaps the work of Haas was the beginning of this. I'm going to show you a little bit of some examples. Baron, again, in the 70s, started looking at with actually recorded signals. What is the impression of people in different sound impulses and different time steps? Marshall developed the early to late ratio curves, which is basically the clarity parameter, the early to late parameter, but not only at 80, but actually at all time steps. And he started comparing curves with rooms between one another. Toyota and Nagata, this is the only publication I found from them. They also looked at early sound, and they developed this reflected energy cumulative curves. And this image is actually, so the parameter is from Toyota and Nagata, but this image is actually from a paper from Hidaka and Beranek, comparing vineyard rooms to shoebox rooms using this methodology. And perhaps most recently, Tapioloki and Jukka Patinen are really looking at spatial aspects with Their large orchestra array that you can see on stage, they don't use a point source, but they actually have quite a lot of speakers on stage. And they measure with this, I unfortunately don't have a picture of this double cross microphone that they can then plot all of the directions and the sound strength of the impulse response in all directions. And the one that we thought would be convenient for our studies and our use in genetic algorithms is perhaps one of the oldest ones. This is the paper that most people cite as the source of ray tracing. This is like Krogstad et al. He started dividing sound reflections into time windows. So he's actually building his own impulse response. He's saying, where does the sound go from 0 to 20 milliseconds? Where does it go from 20 to 40? And this is quite convenient to script and to study. So we're going to be seeing a little bit more of this. So there we get to genetic algorithms. What are these genetic algorithms? Goldberg, perhaps the most quoted academic in genetic algorithms, actually calls them search algorithms, not optimization, which I find interesting. They're based on the mechanics of natural reproduction and natural evolution. So I'm going to briefly take you through what happens in genetic algorithms. Of course, you need some sort of parametric model, some sort of variables that you then code. So basically, the whole range of movement that is possible, for example, in points from a surface is coded in one way or another. It could be binary, it could be real coded, it could be something else. And all of the parameter values are put together in this chromosome, or in this genetic sequence you see at the end that describes the geometry or the model that you want to study. And if you then combine this genome from different high-performing models or individuals, to use the genetic lingo, you start improving the performance of this geometry. Some of the operations that occur in the genetic algorithms is, of course, selection. So natural selections, we first choose the highest performing individuals. So we create a population of individuals. We measure them, for example, acoustically. And then we select the best ones and we mix them together. We make babies, so baby concert halls. This is the crossover operation that you see in this figure. You take the chromosome of one parent and you mix it with the next one, just as you would expect. So it means you get some of the geometry of the first individual or parent and mix together with the geometry of the next one. And if you're lucky enough and the good part about the first parent combined with the good part about the other parent makes you a better child. And because this is population-based, so there are many individuals that you're doing this operation with, probabilities are that you're generation after generation making better and better solutions, so improving performance. But what I'm most interested in with genetic algorithms is they have quite a lot of exploration power. So most of the search and optimization algorithms have this balance between exploration and exploitation. If you try too hard to find the best solution, you might miss out because you're not exploring all of the possible solutions out there. So you have to have a good exploration before you can say, okay, let's start looking into who's best. And genetic algorithms are particularly robust as this. If you look at the images, this is a sequence of instances of genetic algorithm. So the image we're actually looking at, without going into too much detail, let's say the blue area is a high-performing area of the search space that we're exploring. And the little white grasshopper crosses, they are individuals in our population. And you see that in the beginning, there's quite a lot of exploration. There are crosses pretty much all over the search space, but then as we go along, we start concentrating more and more in interest areas, the blue areas. But even better, we don't just go into the bluest one, so the highest performing one. we have individuals in all interest areas, so we actually can compare them. Because, again, our main interest is search, not optimization. So we're not only interested in finding the best one, but we were interested in finding many good ones. And then we can compare for other qualities that might not be involved in our search. We might also be interested in aesthetics that is not involved in the genetic search. So I'm not putting a function to find what is the most beautiful room or the one with the, I don't know, some other performance. But I do want to compare them and to see all of them, to have a lot of data, a lot of information to take back into that early design stage. A lot of data you would normally not have before you start throwing out lines. The first time I did this was for my master's thesis. This is in the Politecnico di Torino. I did this with Martin Jans and Mario Sassone and my acoustics teacher, Ariana Storfi. This was in really quite an exceptional site. This is the Castello di Rivoli. This is an old royal residence in a town outside of Turin. So Filippo Juvarra was the architect at the time, and then it had a really interesting restoration project by Bruno. This was the main scheme. It was a set of boxes underneath this gigantic shell that was to be a structural shell and then an acoustic shell. This is a rehearsal room on the left, and then, if I remember, 1,000-seater concert hall on the inside. There you can see it perhaps a little bit more clearly with this piazza in the middle, covered plaza. It is a little bit of an hexagonal room, so that the walls are slightly slanted. These are the parameters that I used. All of the surfaces are, of course, attached. There are single points connecting the surfaces, but these points are free to move in all three directions. So there's quite a lot of variables for the algorithm. So the number of points, I don't remember how many, times 3. This means that you can get a quite wide range of shapes that are possible, and that not all of them are going to be good for acoustics or for structure. In this case, I was only optimizing for acoustics. At the time, I used just a simple ray tracer. There was no pachyderm at the time, or it was in development, I suppose. This was 2007. Oh yeah, 6. So I basically counted the distribution of these reflections in the audience area and measured how different they were. So the best room would be the one that gave me the most uniform sound reflection, because again, we have a lot of people in the room and we want all of them to hear well, not just the people with the expensive seats. So you can see a lot of different steps in the genetic search, a lot of different rooms. They're all coded and being measured in this acoustic performance value. And this is an image Alberto Pugnale made afterwards. The more and more generations go on, the more uniform the distribution of reflections are. The shape becomes a little bit more regular, but still retains a little bit of irregularity, which was kind of wanted aspect from the beginning, because it was also going to be structural. A little bit of a render of the idea. The walls would not touch the shell. The shell was only supported at backstage and then at the end of the room, so quite a long span. So you can have all this indirect lighting. But again, as I said in the beginning, if you start thinking of this objects, of these buildings as more than just one performance, more than just one aspect, you pretty soon realize that you have to gather information and to search and explore for many aspects. So for my PhD, I started looking into multi-objective search, which means that you don't actually optimize or search for one function, but you search for many. And like I said in the beginning, when you have different functions, for example, in this case F1 and F2, and you're trying to minimize them both, they might not get along. The best ones for one might be the worst for another. So let's just, for example, take this generic problem where the solution A is actually the best one for F1, so the one with the minimal value, but solution C is the one for F2. So what do you actually choose? How do you actually decide on what to do with them? Well, you first gather the best ones from this group. The ones that cannot be said to be better from one another while considering both F1 and F2. And this is what is called a Pareto front, so a set of non-dominated solutions. And you find these solutions by using a special brand of genetic algorithm. Well, actually there are many, but they're all multi-objective algorithms. This is just a flowchart of the one that I used that is called NSGA2. So I started reading into this new genetic search components, and basically what you want to find, what you want to add to the normal genetic process is this non-dominated sorting, so this comparing in multiple functions and not just one, and this crowding distance operator. So what's important is that I not only find all of the solutions that lie in this Pareto curve, but I find solutions that are different from each other. So they're not all lumped together as they are now at the bottom, but I want to find all of them along the curve. Because again, I'm interested in comparing them all. I want to see what they're telling me, what is the performance contrast between F1 and F2, acoustics and structure, or early sound versus late sound, and not just one, because my interest is in exploration. So again, the set of solutions that cannot be said to be better than each other when all objectives are considered, this is what is known as a Pareto front. When you have two objectives, you can easily represent this in this two-dimensional curve that I just showed you, but of course, we won't always have two dimensions. This is an example of energy performance where we have cooling requirements, heating and lighting, so we have a 3D Pareto front. So in reality, what we find is this exploration space made up of tiny little buildings with tiny little different window arrangements, and I'm trying to figure out which one is the best. So I'm very happy to explore and to move around in this objective space and to see the position in relation from one another is actually performance data, and the window arrangements are actually characteristics of the room. So if I'm talking about acoustics, it would be different panel arrangements or whatever. In this case, it is shading and material properties that's changing. So I'll try to show you this in a more acoustic sense. This is the first example I'm going to show you, multi-objectives. This was a comparison of different room typologies. So shoeboxes, fan-shaped rooms, and hexagonal rooms. This is part of my PhD research. So again, Ariana Stolfi is my acoustics professor. Mario Sassone is a structural professor and also an expert in computation and parametric design. Arthur van der Haten and Loena Streppi were also involved in this project, in many of these. So these are my three parametric models. There are three different parametric models, one for each room typology. So then I need to run the genetic algorithm 3 different times. As you can see, the shoebox room can change its proportions, but the area of the room remains the same. So the seating capacity is actually the same. This is the rule that I apply for all of them. So the same absorption of the audience, but not the same volume, because also the height of the room is a variable. Again, Pachyderm was the acoustic software acoustic simulation software that I used. But then the question that I left hanging before is, how do we actually measure what is the best room when we have all of these parameter values from all of these people in the room? How do we combine this thing into one actual number? Because as you know, genetic algorithms need one value to say, okay, this room is better than the other, at least in one aspect, and then you have different functions, but each function needs to give me one value. So in different rooms, I just have different values. How do I combine them? What we did was that we started looking at this statistical distribution of these values. So the first image that you see on the left is the occurrence or an histogram of the, in this case, instances of early decay time values. So at the x coordinate, you see different EDT values and how many times they occur inside the room. So you can see there's one EDT value that happens the most. Perhaps I can see this with the mouse. Probably not. No. So the highest peak is the EDT parameter that occurs the most in the room. So in the center image, we see a representation of this distribution in a curve. So we actually take this distribution and we create a curve out of it. And in the last one, we introduce the optimal value that we want to get. So as you see, this W curve that is a Gauss curve, it is centered on what is the best possible value we want for this room. So if we decide that we want an early decay time of 2 seconds, then we put this Gaussian curve in the middle, and we penalize all of the seating positions that are not close to this value. So the farther away you are from this value, the worse rating you get. But we're normalizing this for each parameter with the just noticeable difference. So how do you compare reverberation with clarity, for example? You measure, and acousticians have done this for a long time, how much can the ear actually perceive a difference? So is 1 dB a difference, something that I can actually differentiate in my mind? Acousticians have done this rounds of tests for each parameter, so we have a J and D value for all of them. So I'm using the J and D value as a metric to compare all of these values. So what we came up with was this QD, or quality distribution, that is actually not exactly the area of the curve of the interceptions, but really close. And this value is between 0 and 1. So we can say a room that has a QD value of 1 has all of the listening positions exactly at the optimal value that we want. If we have a room with a 0 QD, it means none of the listening positions are even close to the optimal value. So what did we do now that we have this parameter? In the first case, we actually didn't use a genetic algorithm because this 3 parametric models were very contained. So we had like a maximum length of the room and a maximum height. So we could actually measure, let's say, not all of them, but quite a few of them. So the most important or the most relevant ones. So we can actually map, again, almost all of them. And we have this, so it is an exhaustive search algorithm, not really a genetic algorithm. And we map in these figures you see in the bottom, so sorry, in the top, you can see how this in 2D this means. So in the first corner you see the tiniest, the shortest room and the longest, and as the landscape moves, you can see how the room becomes taller and wider. In the case of the shoebox, or in the case of the fan, you can see the angle changing, and in the case of the hexagon, you can see also the scissors mechanism moving. So in the bottom, you see the QD value mapped in Z. So we get a really visual representation on how these rooms relate to one another. So, for example, the first fitness landscape, that is the name of this graphs there at the bottom, represents the QD value for EDT, so early decay time, reverberation. And you can see that for this, the parameter wanted a wide room, but not a very tall one. That was actually the reason, the room that it selected as the best, according to this measure, and also according to the optimal EDT time that we selected. Because if we select a different EDT time, so we follow a different acoustician that has a different idea about EDT or C80, we get entirely different values. So what I'm showing you is more the method and not really the specific results, because they're highly sensitive to the parameter that you choose and the optimal value that you choose. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go through them quite quickly, but you see that we have quite a variation. So in most parameters, so the geometry of the room influences very much the sound quality distribution of these rooms. This is for lateral. You can see they're all kind of lacking in lateral. None of them are even close to 1, but this is because this parametric model doesn't have balconies. We actually did a study afterwards with one of my students, Denise Barbarou, and with any balcony, no matter how wrong its geometry, the lateral qualities improved a lot. So you can have a really good quality that makes it improve even more, but the worst thing you can do is to have no balconies at all. So here we see all of the landscapes combined, but this is really not a good way to compare how these rooms relate to one another in terms of multiple criteria. For this, we go back to those Pareto fronts. I'm going to show you. Here we go. So each one of these 2D graphs is actually a representation of a 4D Pareto front, because we have 4 objective functions: EDT, C80, so reverberation, clarity, sound strength, and LF early. So these are sections through a 4D space, let's call it. And there we can see, like it was predictable, for example, in the first one, that the more you improve reverberation, the less clarity you get. And there we can see in this, these dots, the squares represent the non-dominated shoeboxes, so the Pareto shoeboxes. The triangles represent the hexagons, and the triangles represent the fans, and the hexagons represent the hexagons, clearly. And we can see that, for example, for reverberation, the shoeboxes are quite better than any of the other rooms. So we want, this is, like I said, QD optimizes to 1, so we want to be in the top right corner in all of these parameters. Another interesting one is this one here. So this is C80. We can see that in the case of the hexagonal rooms, the more we actually increase the performance in C80, the lateral decreases dramatically. So this room is not, this geometry is not really well fitted to suit both. So this is kind of data that you need to, that you can get in the beginning when you make the decision of what kind of room do you want. This is, again, information for early design. This is not an automatic process that will give you the answer at the end. This is your options and valuable information for you to consider at the end. These are all the Pareto rooms that we found in this process. So if we consider not the 2D sections, but actually the 4D representation, these are the geometries that we found. So not all of them are shoeboxes, not all of them are fans. Some rooms are better, some typologies are better for reverberation, some are better for sound strength, for example. And this is all information that it's quite useful. The next research project I'm going to show you is again from my PhD, so the same people are involved, and this is using the time windows approach that I mentioned earlier. First, we did a little bit of that demonstration that the NURBS surfaces are actually really accurate at reflecting energy as compared to mesh geometry. Mesh geometry is, of course, flat discretization, so flat little panels that represent curved surfaces. The graph we see is actually how much energy do you get if you fire one shot from the focus of one ellipse and you listen at the next. So because the ellipse has this property that all of the radii connect from one focus to the other, you should get all of the energy back that you fire from one focus into the other. And when you have discretized geometry, this is not the case, because the geometry, again, is not perfect, it's not discretized. So if you see the graph, the curve at the bottom is the amount of energy that you get back, the percentage of energy that you get back with a mesh with 10,000 faces, so quite a dense mesh. and we don't even get 20% of the energy back, while if we do this with NURBS, we get all of the energy back, so the reflection is perfect, the geometry is perfect. So this is quite an advantage in ray tracing. So NURBS geometry is the way to go, so we did use NURBS geometry. In this example, this is again a shoebox room, and in this case the variable is actually the control points of this NURBS geometry, so we're moving the curvature of this room. But we did it in such a way that we knew exactly what kind of outputs we could have. So for example, the flat roof is one of the possibilities, so we could actually generate all of the flat possible solutions up to a certain height. We could have variables, so cylinders, double curvature, any kind of curvature. And we started looking at time windows. These are the Pareto solutions of this research project. So you can see that we were optimizing 3 time windows separately, so 3 fitness functions from 0 to 80 milliseconds, what kind of energy we would get in those 80 milliseconds, 80 to 120, 120 to 200, and you see the distribution of energy. Some are better at having uniform values in one window and the next. And you see that all of the geometry is quite curved, some of it concave, which is quite interesting because concave geometry we relate to high concentration, but really shallow curves. And there we come back to multidisciplinary design, so not only acoustics, what can we do in different kind of performance situations? Can we actually optimize for different disciplines at the time? So again, this kind of integration that I loved in this room, acoustics and the integration of the arts and the performance of the space. And here we get to my interest in shells, which I also showed in the beginning. This is Sergio Musmeci's bridge in Potenza, which is an amazing shell that can actually handle entire trucks and all kind of loads on top. Now a lot of people skate on top, so that's another performance. This is the last one I'll be showing in the research projects. Again, the time windows approach, the same parametric model, the same possible geometry outcomes. And what we get when we optimize for acoustics and for the displacement or the structural capacity of the shells is actually that the curvature increases. The shells become form active structures, but still perform quite well acoustic, because concrete is a material that can take compression and tension, so the geometry can be synclastic or anticlastic. But what happens when we don't have this freedom, when we actually want to have funicular shells, when we want compression-only shells? This is the first research project I'm doing at the Block Research Group in ETH Zurich. Tom Van Melle and Philip Block are also involved. This is Teatre La Masa in Barcelona, made by Rafael Guastavino, one of the master builders of tile vaulting. He's become increasingly of attention because he was involved in really high visible projects in New York, and he emigrated from Barcelona to New York in the beginning of the century. And this theater is kind of an example of what happens when you have extremely concave geometry, so compression geometry, a dome. You get a lot of concentration of sound in the center of the room, or let's say the focus point of this geometry. And this they solved by adding an additional element, this reflector, that is, let's say, foreign to the geometry. By no means mean to disqualify or diminish Guastavino. He was actually very aware of this problem, and this was very sensitive. This is actually a patent he developed with Sabin, the father of modern acoustics. These are sound-absorbing bricks that he would use in the first layer of his tile vaults. So these are porous bricks, so they would absorb the sound, and this would mean that the shape would be focused, sound less. But the shapes in the funicular structures have been improving. Analysis tools have been improving. This is the Martin Luther King Park vault that is being currently developed at the group. you can see that the shapes are not really confined to domes anymore. These are highly free-form surfaces. In this case, this is not masonry, not tile bolting, sorry, but these are stone bolts. And these are being developed with the Strauss network analysis method that was developed by Philippe Bloch during his PhD. The main idea here is to have a form diagram actually controlling the forces that are enacted in this shape. So the geometry is not only there as a result of the initial form input or the form diagram that you see at the bottom, but the geometry is actually a result of the loading conditions on the shell and the internal forces. So just to show you what can happen with this, these are all compression-only shells that are made following this method. These are quite different shells, but even more interesting, this is Rhino Vault, which is the Rhino plugin that is developed in the group. Lawrence Lacauer, Philippe Bloch, and Matthias Rittmann are involved in this plugin. So here you see them modifying the force diagram and finding horizontal equilibrium of forces, and this is the influence it has on the shape. So this is another kind of parametric model. You can see how increasing the forces, so increasing the size of the elements in the force diagram, means that the shape of the arch becomes shallower. So a shallow arch carries more loads than a tall arch. So using these forces, you can actually shape the surfaces quite freely while still having compression-only surfaces. This is a different example, representation of this project in Stuttgart. It's not a project in the group, but you can see that you can actually also have quite dramatic landings and geometry. So not only domes, but actually a free-form surface. So this presents quite a big opportunity in acoustics because we have quite a lot more freedom, and the shapes can be not only concave, but it can actually have a lot of convex geometry. We're actually applying this idea in this project in Barranquilla, in Colombia. This is an art school that we're doing with the Urban Think Tank chair and the Building Systems chair of Professor Arnold Schluter. It is a concrete structure in the center of Barranquilla. We're involved in the shell that you see at the bottom that contains an auditorium, a 500-seater auditorium. Here you see it in this more colorful representation. It is a masonry shell that is going to support a concrete shell. So the masonry is used as a lost formwork for the concrete because this area is seismically active. So we have ribs, concrete ribs supporting masonry tile, and then another layer of concrete. And as you can see in this F3 representation, it is compression only. There's actually a plenum inside this shell, so thin tile layer at the bottom, then air chambers that we can actually extract air from, so we don't have additional pipes obstructing our shell, and then the concrete shell at the top. For this shell, we're actually using just 3 parameters. Again, early decay time and sound strength, so reverberation and sound strength again. And because this is a classroom, a theater room, and also a music room, we use the definition as a parameter value to measure how well can the spoken word be understood. So in this case, there is no parametric model moving control points. This is actually a parametric model that is changing the structural stresses that go through all of these ribs. So I'm actually in the parameter, in the genetic search, I'm only moving these lines about so that they modify the structure. And the reason for this is that I'm not really giving it a structural fitness function as I did in the previous example, But because I'm doing it in this way, all of the acoustically optimized solutions that I found are also compression-only structures. So they're really a good starting point for a structure, because the forces inside of all of this shell will all be compression forces, so we optimize the material. These are some of the solutions that were that came out of the genetic search. Some of them are quite extreme in geometry. Some of them are quite pleasant. I often find people talking, when they talk about genetic algorithms, they say they get a lot of garbage out, and this is because they mainly expect them to be finished or polished solutions, but they're actually information. They are data. Even the wrong ones, the garbage is actually telling you some information that you need to learn from. So if you're expecting a polished solution, you will always be disappointed. But if you want data, you will have a lot of information. So again, all of the generative solutions are compression-only solutions. We have been focusing on one of them. So this is a couple of views of the foyer. So this part is not acoustically optimized, but it is again a compression-only solutions. So this will be the way to get into this room. Nice images. So the inside is symmetric. We made it in such a way that in the longitudinal section we have this concave part at the end, but a convex shape on top of the stage. We found that this was giving us the most optimal values for definition, especially. And then we started also playing around a little bit with the materials of the sidewalls, because the client wants this room to be good for everything, and this is always risky, but nevertheless, that's what they want. We started putting absorption material and seeing what happens. And as you can see, the distribution of values, it remains, I would say, constant or uniform, but the values themselves change. So it means that the shape is actually doing its job, and it's up to the material to get more or less reverberation, but we get pretty much constant reverberation values in the room. So the distribution of values is actually doing a good job. This is, of course, less clear with G, because on front of the stage this will always be stronger. But nevertheless, we have G values even in the back of the room. I understand that this is a small room, but still we have good enough values for G. And this is also true for D50. We have values that are above 50% in most cases. Here you see the QD values for all of the room, depending on material absorption. And with this I end. Sorry, I think I went very long. I would like to thank my team in Turin and my team in Zurich for their collaboration, and you guys for inviting me for the talk. Thank you for listening.
I have a question.
Yes.
It's really exciting talk. It's really nice to see that sort of level of research and commitment going into the development of acoustic spaces. But I'm a bit sort of not concerned, but the way that you've actually sort of quantified the perfect, sort of all the early decay times and the rest of it. I mean, one of the things as artistically, I mean, pulling this back from the science into a creative context is where the room actually starts to challenge the musician. Mm-hmm. And when you actually have a room that is actually sort of perfect, then is precedent set? Is that how can there be a cyclical relationship between the development of the room as well as the repertoire that goes to form it?
I had a little bit of the same conversation with Eckhart Kahle, and his answer was that rooms are always going to have their characteristic sound no matter how much we optimize them. So it's actually okay to try to optimize them as much, because we will never get to the point where the perfect room exists and we are actually just copying it from there on. And again, it's also a matter of what we want out of the room. This is a tool to get you to what you want, or to approximate you to what you want. But what you want will always be different. You will always have a musical director that wants some qualities. And not all of the qualities in the room are actually acoustic. For example, a lot of musicians love vineyard rooms, from what I gather. But of course, because they're surrounded by people, and this is part of the experience that you're talking about, they feel more engaged and they probably perform better. But of course, if you're behind the orchestra, you will never hear the piano because it's facing forward, or on soprano, you will never hear. So I found that these tools, again, are only information giving to what you want, but it's up to you to decide what you want. So I'm not that concerned in that sense, because you're always going to have different qualities in different rooms and different qualities inside the room. So to strive for high quality in a room, it's a step in the right direction, but it's not the death of the creative process. And you can actually also disagree with me and say, no, but I don't want them to all listen the same way. I want this one to listen this way and that one to listen this way. And you can use the same tool for that as well.
I think that's where I'm going with it.
Okay. Yes?
You mentioned porous bricks as being sound absorbent. Just wondering what the potential is of using concrete, rubber masonry or stone, exposed thermal mass in that way, having it porous, as opposed to having soft things to absorb sound in various kind of spaces like foyers or consoles or whatever.
I briefly mentioned it because it was I was trying to defend Guastavino after I trashed them a little bit. You don't always want absorption in concert halls, of course. You actually want to avoid it as much as possible, because you have the audience there that is the most absorbing thing, and you want to avoid it. Basically, or at least you should strive to have only absorption to get rid of echoes or mistakes. But I don't know. I don't know exactly. I haven't seen measurements on this particular kind of porous material, or strong porous material, and how much it actually absorbs. I would assume it's not up to par with more soft materials, of course. And then you basically have them in stone, so you cannot use variable acoustic. You have them there, so you have to live with them. So it's not an approach that is probably followed up more after this patent that is probably lost and found recently. I don't know if that answers your question so much.
It's a start.
Okay. Yes.
Hi. Yes, as an acoustician, I have to say that it's very impressive level of detail that you've gone into. What I like most is that you're really looking at how to optimize the geometry before us acousticians come in with all our finishes and suggestions.
Not before, during.
Or during, sorry. But I do have one question about your modelling approach.
Yeah.
Does it go so far as to analyse the frequency distribution?
Yeah, I mentioned sound frequencies only when I was talking about impulse responses. This is actually a fairly good point, that you would need a QD value for each frequency band. We are recently having this discussion and see if we can actually do anything better. But I think averaging or mixing, you can. So the ISO standard tells you to maybe average 500 to 1000 hertz, but and then you have sort of a general idea of the mid frequencies, but then you always have to go through the whole spectrum. You hear people that are not comfortable with ray tracing in terms of low frequencies, and they're more comfortable with CFD and this kind of stuff. So in my work, as a, again, early design tool, I try to concentrate on mid frequency, so 500 and 1000 hertz.
So that's for the speech, and then when it comes to looking at music, perhaps going lower down the end.
Sure, sure, and higher. I heard Tapio Loki give an entire presentation on the importance of high frequencies, and really high frequencies. But the funny thing was is that Blauert was in the room, and the psychoacoustics really relevant. And he said, do you know what the average age of the listener is? They're older than me, and he was, I don't know, Blauert is 80 or something. By then, we cannot hear stuff that high stuff. But of course, this is disproven, for example, in the case of the Venezuelan project, where there are mostly kids, really young people doing this kind of job, and there, of course, high frequencies are also there. But I agree with your point, and I didn't show any work in high frequencies or low frequencies, but it's surely important. Yes?
Hi. I think I'm going to take from what Paul said before, and
Sure.
into the architectural process.
Yeah.
And I know you work with IEDELearn and optimizing the stream that you were already given. But
well, in that case, it was again more parametric modeling. Nagata is actually pretty secretive. Like I said, I only found a few publications from them, so I do not claim any acoustic work in that project. But in other cases where I do, I don't know where you were going with the question, but I always, as the same level of involvement with the acquisition, I think the architectural input, especially in deciding what the architectural model is, the parametric model, so what the room can do or cannot do, I think is very important. But please finish your question.
yeah, that's pretty much where I was going to go, and where
Yeah.
you see, as an architect, and having worked as an architect as
Yeah.
well, in the architectural process, if you were, and maybe Paul will jump in and say something to on the answer of the question, but in which point do you actually see, this optimization? Well, I see the line between search and optimization quite blurry, to be honest, because once you get given a shape, then you optimize it before you start looking again, or
no, that's not true.
Thinking from the architectural process, and you develop a case, you develop a shape.
It takes a certain kind of architect to let you look at a lot of shapes and not the one that he wants and tell you, is this okay or is this not okay? I'm not that interested in that process. Mm-hmm. I don't want to work with an architect that says, okay, take this shape and modify it, and don't modify it, but make it work basically. This is not what I find interesting. I find interesting an architect that tells me, let's work together. I know I don't want this, I want something there, or let's see what happens, and I tell you, okay, this direction is better than this one. This is definitely something I don't want, regardless if it is great acoustically or not. Yeah. So this is the kind of process I'm more interested in, architects that actually want to listen to data and incorporate it and move things together. There are firms or processes that would not work in this scenario, and I understand completely, but this is what
I think sorry, I didn't mean to say that you just get given a shape and that's what you do,
Sure.
but in a building where the program might be more complex and
yeah.
you may have more activities
yeah.
than beyond the performance phase,
yeah.
then how to, of course we need some flexibility from the architectural side,
yeah.
but then there are also more variables and more information data that you need to be dealing with to fit into what the shape is ultimately going to be.
Yes, there's always going to be constraints that you have to incorporate. So again, when people find that genetic algorithms find garbage or useless stuff, it's because you're not telling him what not to look for. So if you have constraints and you say, I don't want this room to go beyond this area, I don't want this room to give me flat configurations, I don't want this room to give me convex, the genetic algorithm will find Pareto solutions within those confines. And this is what I find interesting. The generation of a parametric model that suits the design process that you're on is the most fundamental interaction with the architect. Then you have the interaction with the acquisition or the structural designer, where you say, okay, what are the performance values that we're looking for? Do we want people to hear entirely different things and not even see each other? Fine, let's look for that.
I think that this conversation is actually a really good point, and it's actually the point of actually the whole series, which is we're not acousticians, us architects, but using tools like this is enabling us to engage with acousticians and be able to actually carry on the dialogue. I mean, this is freeing us from the tyranny of the Sabine equation, which most people don't understand anyway. And actually we need to be able to talk about it, argue it, and visualize it. And that way we can interface with our clients, with my architect hat on, but we can also interface with the hard science of the acoustician, and together we can actually start to create much more important spaces. So on that very, very beautifully optimistic note, I'd like to thank Thomas for a very engaging lecture, and thank you all for coming, and let's maybe have a beer and carry on the conversation. So thank you very much, Thomas.